Hello, 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 brothers and sisters. I am so glad to be with you today. This is Readings with Regina, and I am Dr. Regina Jennings. And I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my new subscribers. It just makes me so happy to see new subscribers. So I just want you to understand that you have really touched my heart, and indeed, spread the word. The purpose of this series, of course, as I have said in just about every episode, I absolutely wish to raise the intellectual level of my people. And I am starting in the enslavement period because this is how most of us, most of our ancestors got to this country. We got to this country because we were kidnapped in Africa, boarded ships, and sailed into what was then called the New World. Now, before I actually get into the reading today, I do want to talk about just for a second or two some of the things that I mentioned the last episode where I talked about political prisoners and elders being ill in jail. It's terrible. America is awful. They will keep, especially political prisoners, forever and forever. I mean, like 50 years, 30 years, 40 years. If you want to know more about that, and I encourage you to learn more about political prisoners, you can go to any of the two organizations that I put on the banner below, the Jericho movement or the Spirit of Mandela, but in particular the Jericho movement. They've been working for years to get political prisoners out of jail. For example, Mutulu Shakur, the stepdad of Tupac. I mean, he spent decades behind bars to the point that when they did release him, I think he died within a year, and that's awful. So we would like to stop that trend, and we could use everybody's help to stop such an awful trend in the United States of America. Now, I am going to get to the reading. I am going to start with The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. This is a very important book that I want you to know about. This is why I am reading it to you. If I ever say a word that you don't understand, write it down, look it up. This is a very highly sophisticated and academic book. And I felt that it's something that you should know about. You could read it on your own, or you could just listen to me, because the information in this book will give you a more of a solid understanding of how we got to this country. And oh, there's Michael. I mean, Michael Celeste. I'm so glad you're here. All right, here we go. So, my purpose is to make sure that I give you as much of what I know so that you can have a solid foundation about how America really started, because you can get a lot of mythology about America and its origin, especially when you look at movies, TV shows, and listen to politicians, black, white, or whatever. The true story of America is rarely told in its entirety, and I want to correct that camouflaged history. So I'm going to start again. You might remember the ritually scarred man that I talked about the last time I read from this book. Well, Edward Baptiste is still using him to explain how slavery expanded. So he's calling him in this sentence the new arrival. Yet this new arrival's experience would be different. Slavery itself was changing from the first story, the Sugar Island model that had shaped everything in the New World to this point. This man would carry his collar, he had a chain or collar, an iron collar around his neck. This man would carry his collar not to an island or to an isolated belt of settlements clinging to the coast. He was headed into a vast continent. Behind the mist on the mud flats, enslavement would find no geographical limit. No geographical limit, only political ones. And enslavers had structured politics to their advantage. Citizens, not colonials. And if you don't know what that means, just look up colonials. Citizens, not colonials, would own him. Owners' property interests. Owners who got to vote and run for office and govern would drive decisions about him, not the plans of distant imperial bureaucrats. And because the man in the iron collar and all who followed him into the depths of the continent would make not a luxury product, but the most basic commodity in a new kind of endlessly expanding economy, there would also be no limit to the market for the product of his labor. This meant that there was no numerical limit to the number of enslavers or to the number of investors, enslavers, investors, enslavers, investors who would want to chase enslavement's rewards. Only conscience or the inability of the world's investment markets to deploy enough savings could impede the transfer of capital to slavery's new frontiers. All of this was certain, but for the doubt raised by the one big question, whether the United States and all the entrepreneurs who wanted to expand slavery into the great river valley in the middle of the continent could actually hold onto North America's interior. And let me tell you something underlying this, whether they could hold onto the interior. That's because they were still killing off Native American people. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Oglala. I won't go through the list. I've said it before. So there was some uncertainty here. That outcome was still in doubt, even in 1807. In fact, it had been in doubt since the 1790s. And notice that's only like 20 years from 1776, when America was supposed to have gotten its independence from England, and would continue to be so for almost a decade more. For this reason, slavery's expansion was not a foregone conclusion. And 4 great episodes of violence, 3 of them played out along the river system, whose flow rocked the Adventine, that's the name of the ship, at anchor, would decide its fate. As of 1807, 4 out of every 5 people who came from the old world to the new world had come from Africa, not Europe, chained in the belly of a ship, not free on its deck. Huddled masses in steerage class, yearning to breathe free of the famine and poverty of Ireland, Italy, or Russia's shuttles, they came later. 10 million middle passages of African captives had shaped the New World and its interactions with the old. The only other shift on a similar scale was the death of millions of the hemisphere's original inhabitants. Again, that's the death of the indigenous people, the native people that very often welcomed the Europeans here. From the twin realities of demographic catastrophe and Middle Passage empires emerged to dominate the first 3 centuries of American history. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the British. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the British. They made a fortune over here. Once all the gold and silver had been thoroughly stolen, the Aztecs, the Incas, the empires found even greater sources of wealth by laying a belt of plantation colonies from Brazil north to Virginia. Many were small in size, but all were huge in economic and political significance. In 1763, in the First Treaty of Paris, France traded all of Canada for the island of Guadeloupe. Now, how could France have traded all of Canada? Well, they must have eradicated, they must have killed off many of the Native Americans that were there. So once they did that, they owned Canada, and then they bargained for it. They sold it for the island, or they traded it for the island of Guadalupe. What was made on such islands and what made much of Europe's new wealth before 1807 was sugar. The Portuguese brought sugarcane to Brazil at the beginning of the 16th century. They'd already learned how to crush it, boil the sap, and crystallize it on Atlantic islands such as Madeira or Sao Tome. There, Europeans had first combined the volatile ingredients of sugarcane, fertile land, chattel slavery, and enslaved Africans carried far from their homelands. In Brazil, this solution precipitated not only crystallized sucrose from the vats of babbling cane juice in the brutally demanding safra or sugar harvest, but also immense revenue. Prestige consumers in the economies of late 16th century Western Europe ate sugar and more sugar. Brazil was, for a time, early modern Europe's Silicon Valley, the incubator of techniques for making massive profits, a synonym for sudden wealth. Within 50 years, Barbados shoved Brazil from the top of the sugar heap. The heyday of Barbados lasted only a few decades, for Jamaica rose next to command credit and fame. On island after island, Europeans and their pathogens, along with just slaughtering them with superior weapons, their pathogens killed the natives. Slave ships appeared on the horizon and cane sprouted in the fields. Streams of survivors crawled forth from slave ships to replenish the cane field work gangs of men and women as they died. Let me just tell you, let me add emphasis to this. The Europeans worked the Africans so hard that many of the Africans on these islands making sugar died within 7 years. So those gangs of Africans who died had to be replaced. And that's what Edward Baptiste is talking about. But I wanted to add that 7-year time period in which the Africans were worked to death. Okay. The Sugar Island process of destruction and implantation shaped the geopolitics, economics, and culture of the first 3 centuries of the New World. Virginia and South Carolina were different from the islands, yet they were channels of the same current. The northern colonies were irrelevant until they evolved trades that the islands needed. Shipbuilding, absolutely. How are you going to keep going back and forth to Africa without a ship? So the colonies that were owned by enslavers in America, they built the ships to keep this process going. They grew grain and also livestock raising and started distilling sugarcane molasses into rum. Here comes alcohol, carrying slaves and trading in slave made products. So you see, even if the citizens in Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, whatever, didn't own vast plantations, they did own slaves. And those slaves could, in fact, make commodities that the islands, Brazil, Jamaica, Haiti, they needed their commodities to keep the system going. And let me just say this too before I get to Blake, my love, I love Blake. Let me just say this too. They also made in America. They made, I'm trying to find the right banner here. Is that, nope, I don't want that banner. Ah, this is a good one. In America, enslaved people also made instruments of torture for American enslavers and also for those in the islands. Because how do you make an African, a human being, into a slave and a slave for life? Well, you beat them and beat them and beat them. So all kinds of torture instruments had to be made. I was going to show you pictures of these, but I said, I'm not going to do that to the people. I'll just talk about it. But there was one particular instrument that has always blown my mind. It was a paddle, and the paddle had holes in it. So when the enslaver would beat the enslaved, there would be blisters all over the arms and all over the back. And they mostly did the back because they didn't want, to mess up people's arms and hands because they had to pick cotton. You see? So Americans made products, commodities that the islands could use to keep their enslaved population intact and to keep them working, and often working to death. Okay, now I'm going to read from Blake. And, the last episode I already went off on what these new publishers are doing with the cover of Blake, but I'm not going to go back over that because I really want to get to the reading today. All right, now, so we left Blake. Blake is on board this ship, right? And he sees this guy who's in chains, and they had an exchange. This was a free mulatto man. And notice that the word mulatto comes up. Today, people call it colorism. But back during enslavement, there was a whole list of different categories of color. And I'm going to talk more about that next week. But this was a mulatto man. Often, mulattoes were really preferred to be slaves. Okay, but sometimes, many biracial people would in fact have a better time. Well, I don't even know if I want to call it a better time during slavery than, say, their darker brothers and sisters. I'll get more into that probably next week. Well, anyway, Blake has told this guy who's in chains that he needs to escape. And if he has to take his master with him, then just get rid of the master any way that he could. Because understand this, Blake's mission on earth was to spread the word of revolution, insurrection among those who were enslaved. All right. So let me see. This is Blake talking. Are you never awake when he's asleep? Often, but I'm afraid to stir lest he wakens. Well, don't you submit. Die first. See that? Liberty or death. If thereby you must take another into eternity with you, were it my case, and he ever went to sleep where I was, he'd never wake up in this world. I never thought of that before. I shall take your advice the first opportunity. Goodbye, sir, hastily said the young man as the bell tapped a signal to start, and Henry stepped on shore. Let go that line, sternly commanded the captain, Henry obeying orders on the shore when the boat glided steadily up the stream, seemingly in unison with the lively though rude and sorrowful song of the black firemen. I guess they call them firemen on board the ship. Maybe they shoveled coal into the furnace. I really don't know. But anyway, this is what the black men aboard the ship would sing. I'm a going to Texas. Oh, 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 oh. I'm a going to Texas. Oh, 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 oh. Having, in consequence of the scarcity of spring houses and larders along his way, in so level and thinly settled country, Henry took in his pouch from the cook of the boat an ample supply of provisions for the succeeding 4 or 5 days. Thus provided for, standing upon the bank for a few minutes with steady gaze, listening to the sad song of his oppressed brethren as they left the spot, and reflecting still more on the miserable fate of the young mulatto freeman, Lewis Grimes, held by the slaveholder, Dr. Thomas Johns of Texas. He, with renewed energy, determined that nothing short of an interference by divine providence, that's God, should stop his plans and progress. In soliloquy, said Henry, yes, if every foe stood marshaled in the van, I'd fight them single combat, man to man. And again, he started with a manly will. Notice how Martin Delany uses his language, a manly will, as fixed and determined in his purpose as though no obstructions lay in his pathway. From plantation to plantation did he go, sowing the seeds of future devastation and ruin to the master and redemption to the slave, an antecedent more terrible in its anticipation than the warning voice of the destroying angel in commanding the slaughter of the firstborn of Egypt. Himself careworn, distressed, and hungry, who just being supplied with nourishment for the system, Henry went forth a welcome messenger, casting his bread upon the turbid waters of oppression in hopes of finding it after many days. Holding but one seclusion on each plantation, his progress was consequently very rapid in whatever direction he went. With a bold stride from Louisiana, he went into Texas. Here he soon met with the man of his wishes. This presented in the person of Samson. Now, with a name like Samson, you can imagine what this guy looked like. On the cotton place of proprietor Richardson. The master here, though, represented wealthy with an accomplished and handsome young daughter, but he was a silly, stupid old dolt, an inordinate blabber, and a wine bibber. The number of his slaves was said to be great, and the owner of 3 plantations, one in Alabama and the others in Texas. Now, Samson, check this out, was a black, tall, stoutly built, and manly. Notice this keeps coming up, manly, possessing much general intelligence and a good looking person. Now, check this out. Check this out. Because we're talking the 19th century here, the 1800s. And Blake is already using black as positive. And we thought we invented that in the 1960s. Black is beautiful. Well, Blake or Martin Delany wrote about black being beautiful in the 1800s. And this was during a time in which the enslavers were considering biracial people more beautiful. But Blake is saying that black is beautiful. So I just wanted to point that out to you. Samson had a wife. She was neat, intelligent, little woman of his complexion. And they had a family of 5 pretty children. This is blowing my mind. 3 boys and 2 girls. The family entered at once into the soul of his mission, seeming to have anticipated it. He's just telling them, resist, revolt. With an amply supply of means, and after this sentence, an asterisk is here, and at the bottom of the page, the asterisk says, this person had really $2,000 in gold securely hid away, unknown to any person but his wife, until showing it to the writer. See, Martin Delany himself had went around, because he was a free man, had went around to various plantations and interviewed the enslaved population. And he came across this brother who had, can you believe this? $2,000 in gold. It was hid away. And it was hid away because I want to get to Fred. That's why I'm stopping here. That money was hid away because that big brother Samson, let me see, who in the real world? Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, LeBron James. I mean, a big, manly type of brother. He had a wife, he had children, and he was stashing away money. We don't know how he got the money, but he was stashing it away because he was going to escape. All right, now we'll get back to that sometime next week, but I definitely wanted to read Brother Fred. This is very important. You know how I feel about Frederick Douglass. Okay, now let me see where I stopped. Okay, Fred Douglass is depressed because he knows how to read, and the fact that he's a slave for life is just blowing his mind. Okay. I loathe them, you're talking about enslavers, as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of all men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been both a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound and seen in everything. It was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it, and felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. I often found myself regretting my own existence and wishing myself dead. And but for the hope of being free, I have no doubt, but that I should have killed myself or done something for which I should have been killed. While in that state of mind, I was eager to hear anyone speak of slavery. I was a ready listener. Every little while, I could hear something about the abolitionists. It was some time before I found what the word meant. It was always used in such connections as to make it an interesting word to me. If a slave ran away and succeeded in getting clear, or if a slave killed his master, set fire to a barn, or did anything very wrong in the mind of the slaveholder, it was spoken of as the fruit of abolition. Hearing the word in this connection very often, I set about learning what it meant. The dictionary afforded me little or no help. I found it was, quote, the act of abolishing, end of quote. But then I did not know what was to be abolished. Here I was perplexed. I did not dare to ask anyone about its meaning, for I was satisfied that it was something they wanted me to know very little about. After a patient waiting, I got one of our city papers containing an account of the number of petitions from the North praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and of the slave trade between the states. From this time, I understood the words abolition and abolitionists and always drew near when the word was spoken, expecting to hear something of importance to myself and fellow slaves. The light broke in upon me by degrees. I went one day down on the wharf of Mr. Waters, and seeing two Irishmen unloading a scow of stone, I went unasked and helped them. When we had finished, one of them came to me and asked me if I were a slave. I told him I was. He asked, "Well, are you a slave for life?" I told him I was. The good Irishman seemed to be deeply affected by that statement. He said to the other that it was a pity so fine a little fellow as myself should be a slave for life. He said it was a shame to hold me. They both advised me to run away to the north, that I should find friends there, and that I should be free. I pretended, now check this out, this is very important. I pretended not to be interested in what they said and treated them as if I did not understand them. He's fooling them. For I feared they might be treacherous. White men have been known to encourage slaves to escape and then to get the reward, catch them, and return them to their masters. I'm going to stop right here. So you can see what young Freddie's still a kid now. I think he's now around 12. He might be between 12 and 13 years old. Okay. He meets decent Irish people, Irishmen. He helps them just because he's a human. He sees it, they must have been struggling with this scow of stone, whatever that means. They had empathy for him. They had sympathy for him. But Fred couldn't trust them. If these were undecent white folk, they could trick him. They could kidnap him. They could take him and sell him somewhere else. So he could not. Fred was very smart. He could not tell the truth. This is one of the ways that Black people would outslick their masters and mistresses. All right? Because total bondage meant just that. You belong to another person, male or female. You belong, and they could do with you whatever they wanted to do. Beat you, kick you, slap you, rape you, whatever, and still have you work for them. So, in closing, my people, I just want you to remember this. The African enslaved in America, as Edward Baptiste has said, help to make the capitalistic situation, condition under which we live today. And last thing I will say about this. Now look here. If you were well off and then had all these people working for you, yeah. You had time to sit back and be brilliant, yeah. You could come up with new things, new commodities. You could figure out how to run your nation. Because everybody, you had people working for you, right? You absolutely have people working for you. I'm trying to bring up. Wait a minute. Michael Celeste, do forgive me. I'm messing up terribly here. Is it this one? Okay, good. I think it's that one. But in any event, and I swear I'm about to check out. Look, understand the Africans contribute, and it was a total contribution. Okay? And the implements of torture that I mentioned earlier that had to have been made, well, understand, these were commodities. They were commodities that were made to make sure that they were turning a human being, an African, into a commodity himself or herself. Well, my beloved brothers and sisters, I tell you, you know that I pray for you all the time. And I want each of you listening to me, you are to do something wonderful for Black people. Yes, It is your duty while you are on earth, especially if you are of obvious African descent. That is key here because we owe a great debt to our ancestors who were able to live so that we could be here. And the mass tyranny under which they lived, oh my goodness, we just couldn't imagine that. But anyway, I'm going to be back with you next Tuesday. And as always, I look forward to seeing you at that time. And always know that you are truly, truly loved and you were not sent to this earth to not be creative. So take good care, and I'll see you next week.